The world had shrunk to the size of a rough-hewn cabin by a creek that whispered lies about permanence. For Trudy, this was the whole of it. The wind that combed through the tall prairie grass was her only regular visitor, and the sun that baked the mud-chinked walls was her only wealth. She was a widow, a word that felt like a stone in her mouth, heavy and cold. Her husband had chased a dream west and found a grave instead, leaving her stranded in a territory that had no use for a woman alone. She survived on the stubbornness of the weeds in her small garden and the silence she had learned to cultivate like a crop. Her days were measured in buckets of water hauled from the creek and the slow ache in her back. Loneliness was a physical presence, a shadow that sat at her table and lay beside her on the thin corn husk mattress. She had learned its shape, its weight, its smell. It smelled like dust and dried tears. She had come to this place with hope, a foolish, flimsy thing that had torn as easily as cheap calico on the journey. Now, all she had was endurance, a tougher fabric altogether. One afternoon, under a sky the color of faded denim, a rider approached. This was unusual. Travelers kept to the main track, a half-mile north. This man followed the winding path of the creek, his horse moving with a slow, deliberate gait that spoke of sorrow, not haste. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder, his frame filling the saddle in a way that suggested power held in reserve. As he drew closer, she saw his face was a mask of granite, all hard lines and shadows, his jaw set against a grief so profound it seemed to suck the warmth from the air. He dismounted near a cluster of cottonwoods, his movements stiff. He did not seem to see her cabin, tucked as it was into a fold of the land. In his arms he carried a bundle wrapped in a thick wool blanket. He laid it on the ground with a tenderness that was jarring against the harshness of his expression. From his saddle, he untied a shovel. Trudy watched from the shadows of her porch, her hand resting on the worn handle of her own garden hoe. A man with a shovel by the creek usually meant one thing. He began to dig. The rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel was the only sound besides the creek's murmur. The earth was soft near the water, and he worked with a grim efficiency. Trudy's curiosity warred with the instinct that had kept her safe for a year. Stay small, stay unseen. But the bundle on the ground drew her. It was small, too small for a person. An animal, then. A beloved dog, perhaps. When the hole was deep enough, he stopped, breathing heavily. He stood for a long moment, staring down at the blanket-wrapped shape. His shoulders, which had seemed so unmovable, slumped. It was a small movement, but it was a crack in the granite, and through it, Trudy saw a pain that was horribly familiar. It was the same hollowed-out stillness that had taken hold of her when they told her about her husband. She could not stay hidden. Decency was a currency she still possessed. She stepped off her porch, her worn leather boots making no sound on the packed earth. She walked toward him slowly, not wanting to startle his horse or the man himself. He finally looked up when she was 20 feet away, his eyes a startlingly pale blue in his sun-darkened face. They were cold, empty eyes. He straightened up, his hand falling to the pistol at his hip, a gesture of pure, ingrained instinct. "This is private business, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Trudy stopped, her gaze dropping to the bundle. A tiny, perfect hoof, black as polished jet, had slipped out from the edge of the blanket. A colt. A newborn, by the looks of it. Her heart gave a painful twist. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her own voice quiet. It felt rusty from disuse. "There's nothing to be sorry for. It's done," he said, turning back to the grave as if to dismiss her. He reached for the Colt. Something made her step forward. An impulse. A flicker of knowledge she hadn't needed in so long she'd nearly forgotten she had it. Her father had been a horseman, a man who believed there was a spirit in animals that you could speak to if you knew the language of touch and patience. "Wait," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. He froze, his hands hovering over the blanket. He turned his head, and the look he gave her was pure ice. I said, "This is my business." "Forgive me," she said, her courage faltering but not failing. But what was the matter with it? The question seemed to throw him. Born this morning, mare's fine. He was just still. Never took a breath. The words were clipped, each one a shard of glass. Trudy took another step. She could feel the chill coming off the man, a wall of grief and pride. She knew she should turn back, retreat to her silent cabin and leave him to his sorrow. But she looked at that tiny, still form, and the knowledge in her hands began to hum. "Mister," she said, her voice soft but firm, "it might not be dead, only cold." He stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. A flicker of something dangerous crossed his face. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, to his word being law. And she, a woman in a patched dress with dirt under her fingernails, was telling him he was wrong about the nature of death itself. "I know a dead horse when I see one." "And I know a cold one," she countered, the words leaving her before she could stop them. She pointed a trembling finger. "Look there, at his nostril. There's no frost." The morning had been bitingly cold, a late spring frost clinging to the grass in the shadows. A body that had been dead for hours would have shown it. He looked. He didn't want to, but he did. His gaze followed her finger. He knelt, his big frame folding awkwardly. He leaned close to the colt's nose. Trudy held her breath. He was silent for a long time. When he looked back at her, the ice in his eyes had fractured. A sliver of desperate, agonizing hope was fighting its way through. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying let me try," she said. "The earth will wait. Give me an hour." He was the most powerful man in the territory, though she did not know it then. His name was Dutch, and his ranch sprawled over 3 counties. His word could make or break a man. He had lost his wife years ago, and the loss had carved him out, leaving a quiet, competent shell. This Colt, the firstborn from his wife's favorite mare, was something he had allowed himself to hope for. Its stillbirth felt like a final, cruel joke from God. And now this woman, this stranger by the creek, was offering him the one thing he had learned never to trust: a chance. He stared at her hands. They were not delicate. They were chapped and capable, with short, clean nails. They were hands that knew work. For a reason he could not name, he trusted those hands more than he trusted her words. He gave a single, curt nod. 1 hour. Trudy didn't waste a second. "Bring him to my cabin," she commanded, her voice taking on an authority that surprised them both. She turned and hurried back, her mind already racing. Warmth. Friction. That was the language the body understood. He followed, lifting the colt as if it were made of spun glass. He had to duck his head to enter her tiny home, and his presence immediately overwhelmed the small space. He looked out of place, a hawk in a sparrow's nest, surrounded by her meager but tidy possessions. A single pot, a stack of 2 plates, a worn Bible on a crate that served as a table. He laid the colt on the clean, swept floorboards near the hearth, where the embers of her morning fire still glowed. Trudy was already moving. She threw dry kindling onto the embers, coaxing them back to life. She grabbed the rough wool blanket from her own bed, the only one she had. "Take off that wet one," she ordered, not looking at him. He obeyed without a word, unwrapping the colt from the saddle blanket, which was damp from the morning dew. The little body was limp, its black coat dull. "Start rubbing," she said, pushing her own blanket toward him. His legs, hard, like you're trying to start a fire in him. She turned to her own supplies. From a small wooden box, she pulled dried herbs, yarrow, ginger root. She crushed them in a tin cup, adding a little hot water from the kettle that was always near the fire. The sharp, spicy scent filled the cabin. While Dutch rubbed the colt's thin legs with a focused intensity, his large hands surprisingly gentle, Trudy took a clean rag, dipped it in the warm herbal water, and began to work on the colt's chest and neck. She worked with a fierce concentration, her world shrinking to the feel of the cool, soft coat under her fingers, the resistance of muscle, the absolute stillness of the creature. She talked to it, her voice a low, steady murmur. "Come on now. It's too fine a day to be sleeping. There's milk waiting for you. A whole world of sunshine. Just a little fight. That's all I'm asking." Dutch said nothing. He just watched and worked, his skepticism slowly dissolving into a raw, focused awe. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the sureness of her touch. She wasn't performing a miracle, she was doing a job. It was a kind of competence he understood, a deep, practical knowledge that had nothing to do with books or money. It was knowledge earned through observation and necessity. Minutes stretched into a half hour. The fire crackled, warming the small room. The only sounds were their breathing, the rasp of wool on hide, and Trudy's soft encouragement. The colt remained inert. Dutch's hope, which had flared so brightly, began to gutter. The granite was returning to his face. "It's no use," he finally said, his voice flat. "Be quiet," Trudy snapped, not unkindly. "He can hear you." She ignored him, focusing all her will, all her father's forgotten lessons, into her hands. She placed her palms over the colt's ribcage, feeling for the faintest flutter, the ghost of a beat. Nothing. She pressed, a gentle, rhythmic pressure, trying to mimic the nudge of a mother's nose. "Come on, little one, wake up now." And then she felt it. A tremor. A tiny, insignificant shudder that was not from her own hands. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed again. The colt's nostril flared, a sudden wet intake of air. Its ear twitched. Dutch saw it too. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was a ragged, unsteady sound. He leaned closer, his face inches from the colt's. The little horse took another breath. This one stronger, and then its eyes, milky blue and unfocused, fluttered open. It gave a weak, bleeding cry. The sound broke the tension in the room. Dutch sank back on his heels, his face a mixture of disbelief and a relief so profound it looked like pain. He looked from the colt, now squirming feebly, to Trudy. He looked at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. The Creek widow, the woman in the patched dress, had just stared death in the face and made it blink. "I'll be damned," he whispered. Trudy felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her feel like herself for the first time in a year. "He'll need warm milk soon," she said, her voice soft again. "And his mother." The colt, guided by instinct, began trying to lift its head, searching for a teat. It was weak, but it was alive. Unquestionably, irrevocably alive. Dutch reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and stroked the colt's neck. The animal leaned into his touch. He stood up, his head nearly brushing the low ceiling beams. He looked around the cabin again, seeing it differently now. It wasn't a place of poverty, but a place of strength. He pulled a heavy leather purse from his coat. I don't know how to thank you. Name your price." He started to open it, his thumb fumbling with the clasp. Trudy stood as well, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the purse, then back at his face. The offer was an instinct for him, the way he solved problems. But it was an insult to what had just happened in this room. "There is no price for a life, mister," she said quietly. "I did what anyone ought to have done." He stopped, the purse hanging from his hand. He was a man who understood transactions, debts, and payments. He did not understand this. But I owe you. You owe that colt a warm place to sleep, she said, nodding toward the door. And his mother is probably frantic. He looked at her for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. He was seeing not just a woman, but a person of substance, of a quiet, unyielding integrity. It unsettled him. It intrigued him. He put the purse away. Dutch, he said. My name is Dutch. Trudy, she replied. I'm in your debt, Trudy, he said. And the way he said it, it wasn't a transaction. It was a statement of fact, a weight he was now carrying. He gently scooped up the colt, wrapping it in her dry blanket. The animal was stronger now, already kicking its long, clumsy legs. At the door, Dutch paused. I'll bring your blanket back. I know, she said. And she did. She knew with a certainty that hummed in her bones that she would see him again. She watched him walk back to his horse, a man transformed. He was no longer a figure of grief. He was a man carrying a fragile, breathing miracle. The next morning, as the sun was just beginning to burn the frost off the grass, he returned. He was leading his horse, and on its back was not just her blanket, washed and folded, but a large sack of flour and another of potatoes. He set them on her porch without a word. I said you owed me nothing, Trudy said from her doorway, her arms crossed. This isn't payment, Dutch said, not looking at her. He was studying the rickety fence around her small garden, where a post had rotted through. It's a neighborly gesture, and my way of saying thanks. He looked at her then, and his eyes were no longer cold. They were clear and direct. The colt is with his mother. Doing fine. I'm glad to hear it, she said, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't just the gratitude. It was the being seen. He hadn't just looked at her. He had observed her life, noticed the failing fence, understood the unspoken needs. That fence won't last another winter, he stated. It's lasted this long, she countered, a touch of pride in her voice. He just grunted, a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement. He mounted his horse and rode away. Trudy was left with 50 pounds of flour and the strange feeling that her small, quiet world had been irrevocably breached. True to his unspoken word, he came back 2 days later. He wasn't on his fine riding horse but on a sturdy workhorse that pulled a small wagon. In the back were new cedar posts, a coil of wire, and a post hole digger. He didn't ask for permission. He simply unhitched the horse, took his tools, and set to work on her fence. Trudy watched from her window for a while, a knot of confusion and pride in her stomach. She was not a charity case. She had managed on her own for a year. But there was nothing of charity in his manner. He worked with the same grim efficiency he had used to dig the grave, his powerful shoulders moving with an easy rhythm. He was not fixing her fence for her. He was just fixing a fence that needed fixing. She finally went out, wiping her hands on her apron. You don't have to do that. He didn't stop digging. I know. I could have managed. He paused, leaning on the tool, and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his leather glove. No doubt, he said. But my arms are stronger than yours. It's faster this way. It was a simple statement of fact, stripped of any condescension. He was a practical man. She found she had no argument for that. Instead, she went inside and brought him a dipper of cool water from her bucket. He drank it down in 3 long swallows, his throat working. He handed the dipper back, and their fingers brushed. A jolt, small but sharp, passed between them. Trudy pulled her hand back as if burned. Dutch's eyes met hers, and for a second, she saw a flicker of the same surprise she felt. He quickly looked away, turning back to his work. They worked the rest of the day in a comfortable, charged silence. She weeded her garden inside the new perimeter he was building, and he set posts. The air was filled with the scent of turned earth and fresh-cut cedar. They didn't speak much, but the silence was different from the empty loneliness she was used to. This silence was shared. It was a space between two people, not a void around one. When he was done, the sun was low in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and rose. The fence was straight and strong, a line of security she hadn't realized she was missing. "It's good work," she said, running a hand over the smooth wood of a new post. "It'll hold," was all he said. He packed his tools, hitched his horse, and prepared to leave. "Stay for supper," she offered, the words surprising her. "It's not much. Just stew." He hesitated. She could see the war in him. The part of him that lived in the big, empty house on the hill wanted to say no, to retreat back into his solitary life. But another part, the part that had watched her hands bring a colt back to life, was tempted. "I shouldn't," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The stew doesn't care who you are," she said with a small smile. "It'll taste the same." That made him smile, a small, rusty cracking at the corners of his mouth. It changed his entire face, softening the hard lines. "All right, then." The stew was thin, mostly potatoes and a few carrots, but she had a bit of bacon for flavor, and the bread she made from his flour was light and warm. They ate at her small, wobbly table. The space that had seemed so overwhelmed by his presence before now felt right, full. He ate with the quiet intensity of a man who was truly hungry. She found herself watching his hands again. They were scarred and calloused from work, but they moved with a certain grace. These were the hands that had rubbed life back into the colt, that had built her fence. "Why do you live out here alone?" he asked, his voice softer in the dimming light of the cabin. "My husband died on the trail," she said simply. "This was as far as my money and my spirit would take me." She didn't elaborate on the heartache, the fear. He wouldn't want to hear it. Men like him dealt in facts. "It's a hard place for a woman on her own." "The world is a hard place for a woman on her own," she corrected gently. "The geography doesn't much change it." He nodded slowly, accepting the truth in that. He looked around the cabin, at the neatness, the order she had imposed on her poverty. "You've done well." The simple praise landed in her chest like a warm stone. No one had told her that. No one had even noticed. "I endure," she said. "There's more to you than endurance," he said, his pale eyes holding hers across the table. And in that moment, she felt a profound shift. He wasn't just a grateful rancher or a kind neighbor. He was a man, and he was seeing her as a woman. The air grew thick again, heavy with unspoken things. The loneliness she had lived with for so long suddenly felt acute, a hunger for a connection she had forgotten she was capable of feeling. He left soon after, thanking her for the meal. As she watched him ride away into the twilight, Trudy leaned against the strong new post of her fence and felt a terrifying flicker of hope. It was the same foolish, flimsy thing she thought she had buried long ago. His visits became a quiet routine. He never came without a purpose. He came to check on the colt, which he'd named Creek. He brought the horse to her, letting it graze in her small pasture while he found something else to fix. A loose shutter, a leaky patch in the roof, a step that had rotted. He never asked. He just saw and did. He was a man who spoke through action, and his actions were telling her she was not forgotten. She, in turn, would have coffee ready for him, or a piece of pie made with wild berries she'd gathered. They fell into a pattern of shared work and quiet companionship. She learned the rhythms of his silence. She learned that the tightening of his jaw meant he was thinking of his wife. She learned that the far-off look in his eyes meant he was calculating the seasons, the cattle, the vast responsibilities of his life. He began to talk, in clipped, short sentences at first, and then in longer stretches. He told her about his ranch, the Triple R. He told her about the long, silent evenings in his house, a place built for a family that had vanished. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, not with fresh grief, but with the dull, permanent ache of a healed-over wound that still pulled tight in the cold. He had closed himself off, he admitted one day, not in so many words, but in the spaces between them. He had functioned, commanded, provided, but he had not felt. Not until the day he'd stood by the creek, with a dead colt and a shovel. One afternoon, a storm blew in, a sudden, violent plains squall that turned the sky black. He had been replacing a hinge on her cabin door, and they were caught. Rain hammered on the roof, and wind shrieked around the corners. It was dark as night inside, lit only by the lantern she'd hastily lit. The storm was a wild thing, and it pressed them together in the small, safe space of the cabin. The roar of the wind made conversation impossible. They sat in silence, watching the rain lash against the single small window. Trudy was mending one of his shirts, a tear he'd caught on a nail. Her needle moved in and out of the sturdy fabric, a small domestic rhythm against the chaos outside. He was watching her hands. She felt his gaze like a touch. When she looked up, his expression was unguarded, stripped bare by the storm. It was a look of profound, aching need, the same need she felt mirrored in her own heart. The loneliness wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was a cavern between them, and every part of her wanted to cross it. The storm passed as quickly as it came. The hammering rain softened to a drizzle, and a sliver of watery sunlight broke through the clouds. The world outside smelled clean and new. The tension inside, however, remained. "I should go," he said, his voice husky. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to shrink the room again. "Yes," she whispered, though her heart screamed no. He moved toward the door he had just fixed. He put his hand on the new hinge, testing its strength. He didn't turn around. "Trudy," he said, his back to her. "I don't know what this is." "I don't either," she confessed. He turned then, and in 3 long strides, he was in front of her. He didn't touch her. He just looked down at her, his face a storm of its own. He was fighting himself, she could see it. Fighting his grief, his loyalty to a memory, his fear of feeling anything again. She was a disruption to the cold, orderly peace he had built around his pain. "Every time I ride away from here," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "it gets harder to leave. And every time I ride back, it feels like coming home." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than a touch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to reach out, to smooth the worry from his brow, to tell him that she felt it too. But she was afraid. He was a cattle baron. She was a creek widow. Their worlds were a universe apart. He seemed to see the fear in her eyes. He took a half step back, the wall of his control slamming back into place. "I'll see to the horses," he said, his voice once again gruff and distant. He turned and left, stepping out into the clean-washed world, leaving her alone with the echo of his words and the scent of rain and cedar. The whispers started in town the following week. Trudy only went to the settlement of Redemption once a month for supplies she couldn't grow or make, but the change was palpable. The clerk at the general store, who had always been polite, was suddenly curt. 2 women, seeing her approach, stopped their conversation and turned their backs. She was an outsider, and her existence had been tolerated as long as it was invisible. But Dutch's wagon, seen more than once on the track to her cabin, had made her visible. She didn't understand the depth of it until she saw the woman. She was older, dressed in severe black silk that was wholly out of place in the dusty street. Her hair was silver, pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her face taut. She carried herself with an air of unshakable authority. She was standing on the porch of the mercantile, watching Trudy with cold, assessing eyes. This was Mrs. Pritchard, Eleanor's mother, the town's matriarch, a woman whose wealth and grief had calcified into a rigid, unforgiving piety. She saw the world in terms of its proper order, and a powerful man like her son-in-law did not belong with a penniless widow from nowhere. A few days later, Mrs. Pritchard's black buggy appeared at the end of the track to Trudy's cabin. It seemed to suck the very light from the afternoon. Trudy watched it approach, her stomach tightening into a cold knot. She knew, with a woman's certainty, that this was not a social call. Mrs. Pritchard did not deign to step down from the buggy. She beckoned Trudy closer with a single imperious flick of her gloved fingers. Trudy walked to the buggy, wiping her hands on her apron, feeling every bit the impoverished Creek widow Mrs. Pritchard saw her as. "You are the woman, Trudy," Mrs. Pritchard stated. It was not a question. "I am," Trudy replied, lifting her chin. "My son-in-law is a man of stature in this community," the older woman began, her voice crisp and cold as a winter morning. "He is also a man still in mourning for my daughter, a man whose grief sometimes clouds his judgment." Trudy said nothing. She let the woman's poisoned words fall into the silence. "People are talking," Mrs. Pritchard continued. "They see his wagon. They see him wasting his time on this." She waved a dismissive hand at the cabin, the neat garden, the strong new fence. "They wonder what sort of woman would take advantage of a man's kindness, what sort of hold she might have on him." "I have taken no advantage," Trudy said, her voice low and steady, though her heart was pounding. "Mr. Dutch and I are neighbors. Nothing more." Mrs. Pritchard gave a dry, humorless laugh. "My dear, do not insult my intelligence. A man like Dutch does not fix fences for a neighbor. He is vulnerable. It is up to those of us who care for him to protect him from unfortunate attachments." She reached into a handbag and pulled out a small, thick envelope. "I am prepared to be generous. Enough for a stagecoach ticket, and enough to set you up somewhere else. Somewhere far from here, where your presence will not cause him any further embarrassment." She held out the envelope. Trudy stared at it. It was a dismissal, a judgment. It declared her unworthy, a stain to be scrubbed out. All the shame of her poverty, her widowhood, her loneliness, rose up in a bitter tide, but beneath it was a bedrock of pride that would not be moved. "I do not want your money, Mrs. Pritchard," Trudy said, her voice shaking slightly but her resolve firm. "Your son-in-law is a decent man who helped a neighbor. There is no shame in that." The older woman's eyes narrowed. "You are making a mistake. This town will not have you. I will see to it. Do you think you can stand against me? Against the whole community? You will be starved out. You will be shunned until you are forced to crawl away. Take the money. It is your only sensible choice." "Then I will be insensible," Trudy said. She turned her back on the buggy, on the money, on the cold, cruel face of the woman who would destroy her, and walked back to her cabin. She didn't run. She walked with a dignity she had to fight for with every step. She heard the buggy wheels grind as it turned and retreated down the track. The threat was not an idle one. The shunning intensified. Her small orders for seed and salt were suddenly out of stock. The blacksmith who had previously offered to mend her broken hoe was now too busy. She was met with cold stares and doors that closed quietly as she passed. She was an island, and the sea of the town's disapproval was rising around her. Dutch, insulated by his power and his own isolation, did not see it at first. He continued his visits, his quiet acts of service, but Trudy grew withdrawn. The easy companionship between them was strained by the secret she was keeping. How could she tell him that his kindness was destroying her? How could she put him in the position of having to choose between her and the memory of his wife, represented by the formidable Mrs. Pritchard? She knew what she had to do. It was the hardest decision of her life, harder even than burying her husband. She had to leave. It was the only way to protect him. To be near him was to bring him into conflict with his own world, to tarnish his name. Love, she realized with a pang of grief, sometimes meant letting go. She spent a day packing her few belongings into a small bundle. The cabin, which had been her refuge, now felt like a cage. Every fixed shutter, every strong fence post was a testament to a future she could not have. It was a monument to his kindness, and it broke her heart. She took the blanket he had returned to her, the one she had used to warm the Colt, and folded it neatly on the cot. It was the only goodbye she could allow herself. Under the cover of darkness, with only the moon as a witness, Trudy walked away from the cabin by the creek. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay. She walked north, toward the main track, a ghost leaving behind a ghost of a life. When Dutch rode up to her cabin 2 days later, a newly weaned creek trotting happily behind him, he found the door unlatched. The silence that met him was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a woman at work in her garden. It was the hollow, dead silence of abandonment. He stepped inside. The cabin was neat, swept clean, but it was empty of her spirit. The fire was cold. The coffee pot was scrubbed and upside down on the drying rack. And on the cot lay the folded blanket. He knew instantly what it meant. A coldness that had nothing to do with the weather seeped into his bones. It was a familiar feeling, the icy grip of loss. He had felt it when Eleanor died. He had felt it when he thought the Colt was dead. He had spent years building walls to keep this feeling out, and this quiet woman had breached them all without even trying. Now, with her gone, the cold was rushing back in, flooding every part of him. He sank onto the edge of the cot, his big frame looking defeated. He picked up the blanket. It still smelled faintly of her, of wood smoke and herbs. He had let this happen. His blindness, his slowness, his fear of choosing a new life over the old one had driven her away. He retreated into his damage, the old, familiar pain a perverse comfort. For a full day, he let the grief win. He rode back to his empty ranch house and let the silence swallow him whole. Mrs. Pritchard had won. The town had won. Loneliness, his constant companion, had reclaimed him. But something was different this time. The silence of the house no longer felt like a respectful memorial. It felt like a tomb. He looked at his own hands, the hands she had trusted. He had built her a fence to keep things out, but he had done nothing to protect her from being driven out. He had buried his heart once with his wife. He would not do it again. Trudy had not just saved his Colt. She had been slowly, patiently saving him. The rescue had to be mutual. He made a choice. Not a choice of anger or vengeance, but one of quiet, irreversible purpose. He would not just find her and bring her back to the vulnerable isolation of the creek. He would make a place for her in the world, a place no one could take away. Meanwhile, Trudy had not gotten far. Her pride and her empty pockets had taken her only as far as redemption. She had found a small room to rent, paying for it with the last of her coins, and was trying to find work as a laundress. But Mrs. Pritchard's influence was long. No one would hire her. She was on the verge of true destitution, but before she would starve, she would face her enemy. She took the envelope of money, which Mrs. Pritchard had sent to her rented room via a boy, a final, insulting offer of charity, and walked to the woman's large, imposing house at the edge of town. She did not knock. She walked up the pristine steps and placed the envelope squarely in the middle of a wicker chair on the porch. It was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. She would not be bought. She would not be erased. She turned to leave, her head held high, just as Dutch rode into the center of town. He was not on a workhorse. He was on his finest black stallion, and he was leading Creek, now a strong, handsome young horse. He rode directly to the Mercantile, the busiest spot in town. He dismounted, his movements calm and deliberate. A crowd gathered, drawn by the presence of the powerful rancher. Mrs. Pritchard, having seen Trudy from her window, had followed, her face a mask of cold fury. She stood on the porch of the store, surrounded by her coterie of gossips. "I'm looking for Trudy," Dutch announced, his voice carrying easily in the sudden quiet. "That woman has left," Mrs. Pritchard called out, her voice sharp with triumph. "As is proper. She has no place here." Dutch turned to face his mother-in-law. He looked at her not with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. "No place?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. He gestured to the Colt. "That woman you drove away stood in a cabin no bigger than your pantry, and brought this horse back from the dead. She did it with nothing but her own 2 hands and the blanket off her own bed." He let the words sink in. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, the people who had shunned her. "She showed more Christian kindness than I have seen in this entire town in 5 years, and for it, you made her a pariah." He then turned to the store owner, who was cowering behind his counter. "Mr. Tibbs, from this day forward, anything Mrs. Trudy requires is to be put on my account. Her credit is my credit. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Mr. Dutch," the man stammered. Dutch's gaze swept the crowd again, cold and hard as iron. "And if anyone in this town gives her anything less than their full respect, they will answer to me." He had made his stand. He had chosen her, publicly, over reputation, over the powerful family of his dead wife, over the judgment of the entire community. He had torn down his own walls in the middle of the street for everyone to see. Just then, Trudy came walking up the street, returning from her silent confrontation at the Pritchard house. She stopped, seeing the scene before her: Dutch, the crowd, the Colt. She saw him standing there, defending her, claiming her. He turned and saw her at the same moment. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse. The world fell away. There was only him, and the irreversible choice he had just made. She had saved his Colt. He was saving her place in the world. And in that moment, she realized she had been saving him from his own grief all along. The rescue was complete. He walked toward her, leading the Colt. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. She took it. His grip was warm and strong. Together, without a backward glance at the stunned and silent town, they walked down the street, leading the horse that had brought them together. 6 months later, the autumn sun cast long shadows from the porch of the Triple R Ranch house. The porch was wide, and the rocking chairs were new. Trudy sat in one, a mending basket in her lap, though she wasn't sewing. She was watching the horses in the corral, a band of them moving with fluid grace. Among them was Creek, his coat shining like polished coal in the late afternoon light. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the scent of baking bread and the sound of her humming. She had brought life back not just to a Colt, but to this place. She had opened the curtains Dutch had kept drawn for years, letting the sunlight spill across the dusty floors. She had planted a garden of herbs and late-season vegetables near the kitchen door. Dutch came out and sat in the rocker beside her. He didn't speak right away. This was her favorite time of day, when the work was done and they could just sit in the shared, comfortable silence that had first grown between them in her tiny cabin. He reached over and took her hand, lacing his calloused fingers with hers. "Mrs. Pritchard sent word," he said quietly. "She's leaving. Going back east to live with her sister." Trudy nodded. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness for a woman so trapped in her own bitterness. "I hope she finds peace. Some people don't know how," he said. "I was one of them." He squeezed her hand. "You taught me a different way." He turned to look at her, his pale eyes full of a warmth she now knew was reserved only for her. "I thought I was burying a memory that day by the creek, but I think I was just digging up my own heart." She leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture of comfortable intimacy that was now as natural as breathing. "It wasn't dead," she whispered, her words echoing their first meeting. It was only cold. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. It's warm now, he said. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped together, watching the sun set over the vast open land. The frontier was still wild, the winters were still hard, but it no longer felt like a place of exile. For both of them, it finally felt like home.